Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this is episode 13, actually, of Christ and Nerd Culture. Paul and I are excited that you're still here with us, and
Absolutely.
you, uh, we have we gained so much from reviewing the Twilight Zone and the sense of human nature, and that's really going to kind of color uh, what we discuss throughout this series. Some of these things are really not going to escape us, right? Because one, we've discussed nostalgia already, Paul, and
Yeah,
this is all about nostalgia, right? This is all about
absolutely.
things that um, cultural artifacts and properties that develop a cultural historical context that impacts. And even though these are fictional characters at times, and they were created years ago, they still impact how we see the world and view the world, right? And it's kind of
Absolutely.
inescapable.
They're mirrors at a time that we
Yeah,
can look at and kind of see who we were at that time
right,
and what we reflected, what values we reflected in the moment.
right. And although God is omnipotent and the creator of everything, we still, we still, and this is something we really have to grapple with. How at times we see, the basis of who we are, the essence of our creation, and that we are created. We still kind of measure that or see that through some of these shows and books and whatnot, right? And
Absolutely.
it
Yeah.
helps kind of understand our place in this world and in eternity too.
Yeah. And so as we look at these things, especially, with the Twilight Zone kind of in its era and where it was, as we look at these narratives going forward, we see more and more, like I said, of who we are. They're reflective, obviously, of the writers, but the writers are, lifted from this subset of humanity that
Right.
shows, common traits to all mankind: fear, anxiety, terror, love, all of these things, longing that we want. Uh, and so what I think is interesting is kind of as we shift forward, I know you're going to introduce this, but we're going to see an even wider subset of those things brought to bear. And that opens up a lot of great conversations.
Yeah, it really does. And the thus far we've discussed just the human nature, the human condition. That's what
Yes.
I'm human condition, and how we grapple with all these elements of being a person, with a finite being, right?
Right.
And how we address the past, the history, how our own personal history and the history of others influences the present and the future, our thoughts on life, our thoughts on death, our thoughts on aging, and time, and what that means. So those are all critical elements. Now we're shifting to, as you have called it, the best of us
Mm-hmm.
heroes. And so we're going to start it's maybe it's what we'd call a mini series, a series within a series, a sub-series. We want to spend a little time talking about heroes, and we're going to spend some time talking about the cultural context of heroes, the development of heroes. And from the nerd culture perspective, we're going to focus mostly on how the hero image developed and the hero concept developed in comic books, and eventually comparing that cultural, worldly version and the positive and the negative to the biblical narrative
Absolutely.
version, right?
Right. And this is something, I've been very excited to get to. Like I think I said maybe in the first episode we started talking, this is truly my world. The comics are my biggest geek moment. This is what I love. And so I'm extremely excited about this, especially with, like you said, the theological, psychological, and philosophical
Right.
aspects of what it means to be a hero, and more importantly, what it means to fit that hero in its own culture. Is he an agent of the culture? Does he counterculturally act?
Yeah.
How does that develop? How does that reflect us as people? This is going to be fantastic, and I am so excited to be here.
Yeah, I can tell you're like a little kid at the candy store. We can, and there are examples of both, right? Heroes just dropped into a culture. Heroes
Absolutely.
are part of the culture. When I think mostly of and it's kind of weird when you think of the biblical examples, you're like, okay, they were of the Hebrew culture, and some maybe of different cultures. So they were definitely of their own culture, but God's plan for them was obviously not of that culture. So,
right,
but the culture still influenced it, right? And then
right.
they helped explain, and when they carried out what God had planned for them, God's plan for their lives and for the people. I mean, it still was kind of fit within that cultural context. I think that's fair to say. So,
Absolutely. And, when I think of the biblical concept of a hero, I mean, obviously there's lots of different directions that we could go with this. And as we go forward, and like I said, this mini series, we're going to be teasing these things out. But initially, when I think of kind of the analog from the comic superhero to the biblical kind of superhero, I think of that Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, kind of like if there is the Justice League of the Bible, it is right there in Hebrews 11, as we see, all these great leaders of the faith, the founding fathers of the Jewish tradition leading into Christianity. But what's so neat about them is every single one of them, even though the Jewish people held them up as these exemplars, Abraham, Isaac, David, you still see this fallen nature, this humanity that runs deep inside them. And each one of them had not only their kind of heroic traits, but also their flaws.
Oh, yeah.
And nowhere I think is even more example of this than I think of like Samson. If there is anything close to being superhuman in that kind of heroic way, it's Samson. But what a vile human, and we see this, this unfolding. And as we'll talk about later on in this series, as we get further along in the timeline into the modern era, you start seeing this darkening of the hero, this rise of the brooding hero, the anti-hero. What happens, to quote that famous Alan Moore saying, who watches the watchman? What happens when the superhero is unchecked? And we see that running rampant in Samson, this idea of this wrecking ball of just supernatural energy with no moral compass whatsoever, and the damage that he does.
Yeah, and we didn't also, okay, so you have Samson, who is probably think of an anti-hero. Now he is the biblical version of that. I think of like David, maybe the biblical version of Batman. He's human. He doesn't have superpowers, but he just has his wonderful toys. Yeah. But the Avengers also took that approach, and in starting with Civil War, and it actually was a bit of a thread that stayed throughout until Endgame, and I'm sure that was definitely part of the comic books. This sense of what happens even when the best intentions. Obviously Samson did things where he didn't mean well. He didn't really care.
Right.
So what if even in their caring and their concern, who watches the event? I think they probably even quoted that, and they probably stole it from Alan Moore. But who watches over them, and who keeps the Avengers in check, and this group of rogue heroes in check? And then the question becomes, and then you even get to a market versus government base, which is the approach, and what sort of, obviously there's no way to do that without curtailing their effectiveness.
Yep.
Because that's what bureaucracies do. but sometimes it's like the economy, right? To get that example, they're going to curtail the effectiveness, the full force of the economy is going to be curtailed by government intervention. But then there are examples of capitalism run amok, and what happens if there's no government there to curtail it, and so you just have to decide pick your poison. Which one do you feel? Not only pick your poison, but pick your your milkshake, what you like the best.
Yeah.
To take the greatest with the good with the bad. And you have to understand that comes with the territory, with the hero territory.
Absolutely. Right? And and as we're talking about this, it's just formulating this idea that, as heroes, they have this this essence to them that, like I said, it's the best of us. We expect them to be the best of us, but yet at the same time, there's a certain fine line that those heroes walk where, like take Superman, for example, it's astronomical the amount of power that is written into this character throughout the comic run. At one point in I think the Silver Age, Superman sneezes in outer space and it annihilates a galaxy. And he spends an entire comic run brooding about the fact he wiped out a galaxy because he sneezed. So amazingly powerful, but yet we expect him to fight crime on a micro level. Yeah. And he's vilified if he doesn't help the people. And I think about this interesting interplay, this razor's edge that these heroes walk, where at one minute they're exemplified and the next minute they're vilified. And I kind of go back to this idea of like with the beginning of the Passion Week, where Christ is coming in and they're laying down palms. And on the beginning of the Passion Week, it's Hosanna in the highest. And by that Friday, crucify him, give us Barabbas. It just, we think about, obviously Christ is not a superhero, he's the Lord, but he kind of is. If there's an exemplar to the exemplars, that's what he would be. This savior figure, this able to conquer death. And so it's interesting to see how all these things kind of shingle down and line up in the narratives.
Yeah. And that's very, that's another aspect to it. The people are never satisfied. Even when I think about Pixar, The Incredibles, the first scene, Mr. Incredible, when he's still Mr. Incredible, before they, spoiler alert, before they get sued, all the superheroes get sued for whatever damage. Same thing. It's very similar to what the Avengers probably stole it. This idea that even when superheroes try to save the world, they're going to cause damage, especially if they're all powerful like Mr. Incredible. But he has this French, this explosive villain who uses explosive called Bomb Voyage, and he's French. And so while he's trying to save, while Mr. Incredible, this guy's following him, bugging him, and it's a kid, and he has to end up saving him, and Bomb Voyage gets away. And so at the end, he's explaining everything that happened and all the damages to the police officers, and he goes, Bomb Voyage, got away, so we'll need to do this. And the police officer, we'll need to set up a perimeter and all that. The police officer goes, wait, you got away? Like, you didn't do your job? And you're like, well, technically, buddy, it's your job.
Yeah.
You're the law enforcement. So
absolutely.
But that's kind of, and you kind of get that sense of this is when things, there's that aspect of, and this is something I think we can talk about, the kind of exploring the hero in all of us, I guess, to a certain extent. And when you're called upon, because I think that's very much part of the calling, but it depends on how God's calling, I think, has that sense of heroism, and that we all should embrace it. But it also, we need to call and during our time together discussing this, we need to prune and, I guess, polish and purify that vision of what it's true heroism. And then absolutely how we all can embrace that. So with that said, I'm kind of chomping at the bit can you give us a thumbnail sketch of the history of comic books, if that's a fair way to explain the whole history, and maybe just kind of go era by year and kind of just a short thumbnail sketch for
absolutely
5 eras. Did I get that right? 5?
Yeah, pretty much identified as 5 eras. Okay. There is some question whether or not we're kind of in a new age currently, but absolutely. And really the idea of the hero or the superhero, which was what we're kind of focusing on. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive history of comics, as we talked about. We're not talking Archie comics.
This is big picture. This is big picture superhero. When you think of but here's the deal. When you think of comics, when most people think of comic books, this is what they think of, right?
Absolutely.
There's other, and I'll just kind of throw this out. I remember when I was big into comic books, there were some comic books that were focused on soldiers and military. And I had some of those, but some of those were still kind of, there was sometimes a supernatural element to those where it got kind of weird. And there were some that were, and there were some that were apparition. And there are a superhero named like the Ghost or something.
There's several. There's the Phantom. There's
the
Spirit. There's Ghost Rider. They love to play with those supernatural.
Elements. So there, and those could still kind of fall in it, but then we're probably focused on again superheroes,
right?
And or in the case of however you would categorize Batman,
right?
So. All right.
So as we go back and look at the history of the superhero, we actually have to kind of at least take a pretty wide step back and go back to, mythology. Obviously, if we're talking about the idea of the heroic narrative coupled with some type of iconography related to that narrative, we got to go back to the mythology. Of course, I go back to the Greek myths just because that's kind of my favorite realm, but you can go with Nordic, you can go with Ugaritic, you can go with any of those other pantheistic kind of world mythos that developed. But I think the Greek myths are probably the best example, especially as you see, the frescoes and the mosaics and the different the different artwork that came out of that time period, indicative of these characters. And so, the gods were superhuman,
right,
in their application. They were different in, the Greek pantheon was very humanized. They were different in what we would think of as, especially in the Christian sense of God, totally transcendent, totally, persona in himself, but not humanesque. The Greek gods were very humanesque. They just were basically humans that had some level of divine power. I mean, they still were jealous. They still had affairs. They still had petty squabbles. I mean, there was very much a human element to them. And so as these stories grew, these became the exemplars, the examples of what the people wanted to live up to, especially as they meant to try to appease the gods. They would try to follow their traits. If you wanted to appease Ares as a soldier, spill a lot of blood, be an excellent soldier, and so you exemplified these traits. If you wanted to be, if you wanted to appease the goddess of love, you dress beautifully, or you did these things. So this is really where this idea begins, and humanity has always had some sense of wanting to have an exemplar to appeal to. So as we fast forward into the comic realm, we got to start really back before the Golden Age, and what they sometimes call the Platinum Age, I call the Pulp Age. Okay. And I call it this because, it relates to the pulp comics, those really cheap paper kind of books.
Sure.
They're less comics, more books and narratives. They did have some minimal illustrations. A lot of them either came from published works or radio shows. But you have really the beginnings, the origins of that hero set apart from culture, set apart from society, but working in and amongst society for the sake of it. Characters like the Shadow, right? I forgot his first name, but Lamont Cranston, this character of the guy who has the ability to mess with people's minds and has this very iconic image of the fedora and the trench coat with the red scarf that covers his face and the twin 45s. You see characters like John Carter of Mars, this human who's transported to Mars, and now because he's on Mars has supernatural ability or like superhuman abilities. He's a human, but in their environment, he becomes the superhuman hero. Characters like the Phantom, characters like Zorro, Buck Rogers, all of these characters that have this almost, and what's interesting is most of these have almost a vigilante-esque nature to them. When we talk about the difference between Batman, where does he fit? Most people classify Batman as a vigilante, not a superhero, but they still get included in this as these exemplars because I think it appeals to our sense of justice. We want to see justice done. Now, our version of justice, our idea of justice could be twisted and warped, but we want to see it done. And so that began 1898-ish into the rise of the very first superhero comic, which is 1938, the big one, Action Comics #1, the first appearance of Superman. And that really set the precedent for what we identify as the hero and began what we call the Golden Age. 1938 is pretty much the held benchmark. This is where the Golden Age began. Comics and superheroes really took on their weight. And what's interesting is most of the IPs, the intellectual property that we have related to current comic books, a lot of the big ones came out of that time. I mean, the list is like Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Shazam, Green Arrow, Green Lantern, Aquaman, Flash, pretty much most of the Justice League. A lot of the big heavy hitters in the DC lineup came out of that Golden Age. Marvel was still, what became Marvel was scattered among numerous publishers.
Yeah, because Marvel wasn't unified. Nope. And Marvel wasn't Marvel.
No, and DC really wasn't DC. In fact, it was Detective Comics that eventually took on and started gobbling up these little publishers. Some of these comics were never heard of. Like Shazam's first appearance is 1940 Whiz Comics #2. I've never even heard of Whiz Comics until knowing that. Green Lantern's first appearance was All American Comics. So all of these properties existed amongst all these little publishers, and everyone's trying to get a piece of the game. Well, the bigger names, what we see as Action Comics, Detective Comics, those eventually start taking on these smaller ones and becoming DC.
And Action is Action Marvel, or is Action part of DC?
Action becomes a part of DC.
Okay.
That's the first appearance of Superman.
Okay, yeah.
And so Marvel, there is a Marvel Comics, but it's not nearly what we think about. In fact, the first appearance of the Human Torch is in Marvel Comics, #1, 1939. But that little publisher is eventually going to start gobbling up other ones. And what you're going to find is in the middle of the Golden Age, kind of toward the middle end, a couple of big things come out. One, you're going to see the rise of the two major publishing houses, Detective Comics, which eventually becomes DC, and Marvel. And these two own most of the intellectual properties that form comics, and they start kind of competing against each other.
So do you know who the primary owners were, the publishers who did this? Because that is in my thinking, that predates Stan Lee and all of that.
Yes. Stan Lee wasn't until later in the 60s when he really kind of rose to prevalence. I don't know exactly who the owners of these were. I could look it up and have it for next time. That would be interesting to know.
Let's see. Okay, so wait. Now, Superman has the Action Comics, but I also remember the cartoons. Was that the Fleischer brothers, Max Fleischer?
Yes, I think that was Fleischer. Yeah.
So, but they were not. Were they, or were they not connected with Action Comics, or?
They must have licensed it. I don't think they were connected. They could have been, but I don't remember that being a case. It probably was something licensed.
Yeah, I'll put on the old legal hat for a moment and note that there's a like most intellectual properties, there's a host of copyright and credits. And I mentioned Stan Lee, as you're probably aware. There's massive, and I think proven concerns over his control, creative license of some of the more famous Marvel characters, and whether because we always think of, when I was a kid, I thought, that's Stan Lee. He's the one who created all these characters. I'm like, oh, that's not what happened. Right. And so, Jack Kirby was kicked to the curb. His name recently, because I just remember, like his name has to be shown in the credits for any Marvel movie now.
Absolutely.
And I want to say the Fleischer brothers get the same. They got the same deal. Their estate gave them the same deal for any Superman movie as well. But I can't recall. But that's a all part and parcel of this is the original ownership and who bought what, but also eventually who created what. Yep. All right, hat off. Go ahead. Sorry.
So the Golden Age really was more about patriotism, about setting up those exemplars. I mean, superheroes were truly the best of us, the best of society. The villains were truly scoundrels. The heroes were truly respectable. This is where we kind of get the idea of Superman fighting for truth, justice, in the American way.
Captain America, too.
Captain America. First appearance of Captain America is him leaping over a desk and just punching Hitler in the face. You know, yeah. I mean, you can't get more American than that.
No.
And so we saw these become extremely prevalent during World War II. As the GIs were overseas, they could get these cheaply, keep them entertained, give them stories to talk about, keep them encouraged, keep them, in the fight. But we also see an interesting divide as they become picked up and interested in by children. And so what's also going to come out of the Golden Age is what's called the CCA, the Comic Code of America.
Yep.
And up until this time, your pulp comics and your pulp stories had started to drift into more of your horror and romantic, even kind of a risque elements. And so there was some concern with the new medium, the visual medium of comics, with where these cultural elements would fall, especially as children started to pick them up. And so the Comics Code of America was these publishers' way of self-regulating their publications without government influence. They said, look, we'll back off. We'll guarantee not to show these things. And there's no nudity or sexual innuendo, explicit drug use or drug use in general, gore, extreme violence. These things like that we would kind of consider more in like the R-rated realm, they would not, foul language, they would not put in there of their own volition so that the government would stay out. They could still publish the stories they wanted to,
right,
but it would make it safe because comics were getting, pushed back on heavily. Major cities were having burnings of them because they were concerned that they were corrupting the children. And so if you saw a comic code stamp on there, you knew as a parent, they were held to this standard. And so that set the precedent going out of the Golden Age and then into the Silver. The Silver Age beginning around 1956 with the first appearance, most people consider it with the first appearance of Barry Allen as Flash in Showcase number 4. That's kind of where they put that Silver Age beginning. So obviously culturally, you're well past the war. You're heavily into the McCarthyist boom. You're into the Cold War beginning.
Yeah, you have transitioned from a generation and from images and stories that neatly and clearly delineated and contrasted the hero and the villain.
Yes.
Right from wrong. And probably, is it also fair to say that, and I think you alluded to this, the CCA, the development of the CCA obviously gave them the opportunity to self-regulate. I'm sure to push that over the goal line, they probably had a little bit of, and we'll throw in some pro-America propaganda, and we'll all be good, and everybody be good and heroic, and we won't have any sense of the anti-hero.
Right.
Batman carries a gun at this time, right?
In the very beginning, he did, yes, but that got quickly retconned out.
Okay, yeah, quickly retconned out. And you probably had a greater focus on his detective skills at the time.
Absolutely.
And
it's interesting to look at. So the original character of Batman, Bruce Wayne, as Bob Kane and Bill Finger created, he had a gun. He's very much kind of almost the G-Man style, that late 30s kind of. He smoked a pipe, had all these kind of Playboy-esque vices. And once that started to change in that comic code kind of area, that really got changed really quickly. Of course, the gun went away. That's one of the most long-standing tropes of Batman. No guns.
Okay.
We see him now become a model of physical fitness. So, definitely no smoking. All these other kind of things that came out of that. And so the CCA was very powerful in what it did. And it's interesting how, as powerful as it was then, how hard it's resisted later on in the narrative.
Yeah. So that's just so everyone knows, we are transitioning. And so the Silver Age is it early 60s? And obviously
About
this
56.
56. Okay, so
Yeah.
1956. Barry Allen is not okay. Barry Allen is the Flash. It's 1956.
Yes.
And so we've had this. The pulp was okay. So 1938 to 1955. We've had this very critical golden era that
Yep.
sets the foundation for most of the comic book properties and heroes and characters that we associate with the genre. Now they are
Absolutely.
created during that 17-year window, and they are created on the basis, for the most part, of they are good heroes that we don't question. They don't really question authority. They don't question the government institutions or anything of that nature. They might not directly work with them like a Batman, but they're still very critical here. And so it's going to be important to note all these. I'm just bringing it up because now we're transitioning into the Silver Age. And so take us into the Silver Age.
Yeah. So the Silver Age, of course, like I said, you're at the beginning of the Cold War. We're into now a nuclear age. We understand the power of the nuclear bomb. We've seen the destruction that it can cause. And so as culture is now fearfully treading into this new informational nuclear age,
Right.
We start seeing culture and comics reflect that more. So obviously, we talked about in a previous episode, we start seeing the rise of the spy. 007 is first premiered in the late 50s, early 60s, around this time. Well, also in this time, we see heroes that are not, superhuman in the sense like Superman or Wonder Woman or like, let's say Green Lantern. We see now the rise of the metahuman or the mutated human. So this is also the first appearances of Spider-Man, 1962, Amazing Fantasy 15. We have the first X-Men in 1963. We have the Incredible Hulk in 1961. This human that's irradiated with nuclear energy and gamma rays and becomes this, super beast. We see these characters coming out of a different substance. So now, before it was all kind of the unknown, a lot of them, now we're seeing this unknown as it's tied to science and as science progresses.
Right. And so I can maybe throw in a little, and you're working on your PhD. So my PhD had a lot rooting in positivism, and we discussed positivism.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that's culturally relevant to these characters, but there's also a lot of this scientific, positivistic, we can solve everything through the scientific method idea, yes. I think. And then you start seeing, and there's this reliance, and it kind of lines up with the golden era a bit in World War II, because we start, and we talk about this in urban development, for example, and I think we discuss, we'll probably discuss how urban blight is connected to the Silver Age, especially. But you start seeing, we always look at the modern era for a lot of things I did look at, for a lot of the areas I dabble in, around 1945, obviously, into World War II, government becomes more engaged, and government makes decisions based on data. People make decisions based on data. Corporations become very data-driven. And we see some of these heroes who, and then at some point they start questioning. That's one of the authorities that gets questioned, is this idea of science and that we can prove everything. And it transitions us from the modern to the postmodern era. And we start seeing, hey, these characters, even though they become superheroes and society as a whole might benefit from that, they are victims of science.
Yes.
It changes their human nature
Mhm.
and their context as humans, and it also um, changes their lives, and not necessarily for the better, right? So
Absolutely. What's interesting, some of the philosophical questions that obviously come out of this time is, when you have Spider-Man, who now has genetic mutations that cause him to have spider-like tendencies, is he human? What is he? It
right,
gives rise to this idea of the metahuman, the distance between. That's one of the struggles between in the X-Men comics. You have Homo sapiens and then Homo sapiens superior, which is the new mutant
yeah,
strand. Mutants are higher than humans, and this becomes this class struggle between the heroes and the people that they protect. But also, interestingly enough, in this era, in the Silver Age, before we move out of here, what we also see is one, the two houses vying for
right,
publication power, and we also see the rise of the super team. So DC struck first with the Justice League of America in 1960, and then Marvel had to, not to be outdone, came up with their own super team, pulling from some of their previous IPs like the Human Torch. They created the Fantastic Four in 1961. And so you have this kind of back and forth going forward. We'll see Marvel produces something that DC tries to emulate, and then DC produces something that Marvel tries to emulate, and kind of back and forth.
and I never got into the Fantastic Four for some reason. I just never.
I was not a huge fan.
No, I just never really
And the
found it.
movies didn't help.
The movies didn't help, but as I recall, also this is another thing too. All four of the characters were not necessarily sympathetic or likable. Well, and maybe it's for like Robert, the Mr. Fantastic. He was, from a personality perspective,
Right.
anything but fantastic.
Right.
And then Human Torch was there, and then we had issues with the Invisible Woman, and I guess the only one that was really sympathetic was the Thing. But then he could be, yeah, it just never really resonated with me. But I know nerds who really get into it.
Right.
The I was big into the Justice League, especially the cartoon in
Absolutely.
the early '70s. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
and it's interesting you mentioned that about the Fantastic Four. So they were created with radiation in space. They were all on a space
Right.
station.
Right.
Radiation in space, I think it was, created them. But as opposed to, like, let's say Spider-Man, that had, let's say, some type of tangible DNA interaction, their powers came from whatever emotional state they had, or emotional traits that they had. So like Susan
Yeah.
Storm, the Incredible Woman, she had a desire to protect everybody. So most of her powers came, or she could turn invisible, but it is by creating these force fields around her that would bend light, and she could protect people with these force fields. Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, hot-headed, very impetuous. So of course his powers came out. The Thing, very kind of stubborn, very rock-headed. So you have these personality traits that now become more indicative of the character, as opposed to just something kind of thrust upon them, like Superman was, for whatever reason. He just was super by very nature of who he was. That just was what he was written as. These characters had more character elements. Victor Von Doom, this twisted shell of a man in this almost indestructible suit to protect himself, vulnerable on the inside, virtually indestructible on the outside, and just these ideas of these characters. So what's interesting is the Golden Age was almost entirely DC. DC IPs are all the way through it. The Silver Age was very much Marvel. Marvel kind of had the major run there.
Right. And they both aligned with, DC's characters have this invincibility, have this kind of perfect personality.
Yep. Or the vigilantes. You still had some of those, like Green Arrow, right. Batman, some of those guys.
But it was all done for the right reasons.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
And they were also, they developed, if they did have superpowers, they developed genetically, or it was not of their own doing. They just kind of happened into it, which kind of fits with that what we call the elite era. People who just we are better because we exist. Whereas you have science being
Yes.
the driving force for the Silver Age.
Absolutely.
Right?
And then at the end of the 60s, going into 1970, all the way through the middle of the 1980s, you have the Bronze Age. 1970, that 15-year run is where comics starts taking the turn into more of a cultural relevant medium. So before then, you had these exemplars of society, things that anybody could look at and say, that's who we wish we were. Predominantly associated also with the Anglo-Caucasian cultural type. Well, in the 70s, you start seeing more turns to minority groups, characters like Luke Cage out of Harlem. You see, of course, Black Panther. Some of these other minority superheroes are coming to the forefront. You also start seeing comics taking a turn more toward cultural relevancy. One of the famous covers, like we talked about earlier, was Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams' artwork, actually, where Green Lantern and Green Arrow had a couple of episodes together in that late 60s, early 70s run. It's really interesting because Green Arrow represents the very liberal left, but still a good guy. And you have Green Lantern, the very conservative right. And they would get into political arguments actually in the comics. It's quite interesting as a social commentary. But the famous cover is Green Lantern. I keep getting the greens mixed up. Green Lantern showing Arrow his ward, kind of the Robin to his Batman. Speedy is a heroin addict. And so the big cover, the exclamation from Green Arrow, Speedy, my ward, is a junkie. And, making this social commentary on the drug use that was rampant, recreational drug use rampant in the late 70s into early 80s.
Yes.
We also see in the Bronze Age the beginning of the disillusion of the CCA. People are tired of running under this code that's not even really legally mandated, and they want to write their own stories and have their own properties, but they feel handcuffed to this thing. And so that famous cover I was just talking about, the CCA shut it down, but they still published it anyways and became famous. We see the reintroduction of some of the previous characters in new ways. One of the things I forgot to mention in the Silver Age, we see definitely the Bronze Age, is DC introduces the very first idea of the multiverse with this idea of Earth 1 and Earth 2. All the Golden Age characters are from Earth 2, whereas all the modern characters are in Earth 1. And so you have this way for them to play against each other and intermingle without getting rid of your old IPs. You still have new ways of updating them, kind of keeping them young and hip and culturally relevant without getting rid of them. And so now you see newer iterations. Of course, like I said, Neil Adams drawing the what we consider, most people consider the iconic Batman with the gray suit and the blue with the very scalloped cape. We see some of these other introductions of darker stories toward the late 80s. We see people like Alan Moore coming on the scene with like V for Vendetta, The Killing Joke, The Watchmen, some of these really dark stories.
Wait, okay, when does The Dark Knight come? It isn't
I was
that
going to
around
say Frank Miller is in
Frank Miller, that's right.
85, I believe, 85 or 86, like right in that turn period where we start seeing, these are traditional Batman stories, but truly given the gravitas and grit that people have expected him to have.
And he's a little bit older.
Yeah,
right?
he's 55. Yeah, so he's
That's right.
He's been out of it for a while, and coming back into it, and he's a very grizzled, very disgruntled Batman, just almost bordering on an anti-hero at that point.
Right.
But yeah, I think the one thing that really was so pivotal, and I want to point this out before we move on to the modern era, one of the more pivotal moments in this was The Watchmen, the publication of The Watchmen by Alan Moore in 1985. And The Watchmen is very much that token moment where we move away from the idealization of superheroes and we start realizing the damage that these characters can do, not only to us as people, but physically. And of course, that famous saying, who watches the Watchmen? Who keeps these superheroes in check? These people that have unchecked power, what happens if they go rogue? What happens if they take on the sinfulness of humanity? And that leads us into the modern era, which does away with the CCA. The Comics Code is no more. We see the rise then of secondary publications, people that are wanting to publish their own IPs away from people like DC and Marvel. So you see the rise of Valiant Comics, Dark Horse Comics, both of which produce more bloody, gritty, adult-themed comics. Also, later in this time, you see Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird create the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which were originally a gory comic, very bloody. It's not the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that we think of as kids, with the cartoon that came much later.
Oh, wow.
And then we also see the rise of Image Comics, and Image Comics is really what sets the precedent for the modern era, and not just the modern era, but what we know of as the modern hero. And what it was Image Comics was a lot of artists and creators, I think mainly from DC, who wanted to break off. People like Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee. Of course, Todd McFarlane was from Marvel. He was drawing Spider-Man at the time. A couple more of Mark Silvestri. These guys each had their own idea for an IP that they wanted to publish together. And so they each brought their illustrations, they brought their ideas, and they published them under Image Comics. And probably the biggest heavy hitter that came out of that was Spawn.
Yep.
Todd McFarlane's Spawn. And Spawn introduced this idea of a dark anti-hero that could still in some ways do good and be viewed of in some weird kind of modernist way as a hero, but was hellish. He was spawned literally from hell. He was violent, ultra violent. The language in the comics was very rated R. Nudity in the comics, language in the comics, a lot of violence. And so you see things shift as we've gone through the kind of neo-gilded age of the 80s, and then the crash in the end of 89, going into the 90s, and now into this kind of disillusioned period where, the current Gen X is now reading comics, very much wanting to push against establishment. They are seeing these dark heroes and just loving them. And I remember as a teenager, this was my time to kind of first interact with comics. And Spawn was, Batman was always my favorite, but Spawn was definitely number two, because I loved this. He's different. He's very non-traditional. He was gritty. He took on the elements of life. And you see Image producing more and more of these: Shadowhawk, Wetworks, Savage Dragon. Also, in this time, you see the big houses take notice, and they start revamping and redoing their system. We have things like what we consider the Infinity War kind of coming to an end. Previous runs of comics introduce new iterations. You see Final Crisis and Crisis on Infinite Earths, which kind of had ended in the 80s and 90s, coming into this, bridging this gap of creating new comic iterations. We see Batman get a much grittier, darker tone.
Yeah.
We see Gotham become the cesspool that it is. We see these other rise of vigilante heroes. And so all of this leads us kind of into the current era. And there's debate as to whether or not we're in a new era now, especially with the more culturally relevant wokeness. You see, as culture has shifted from postmodernism into what they call metamodernism, a return to a narrative, but one that is built out of the ashes of postmodernism. So you still have that relativism aspect. Yeah. There's some talk as to, are we in a new comic era? Is this more of a meta age? Are we going back to the narrative, but a narrative that's more socially aware, with this social justice element. So I know that's probably a little bit longer thumbnail sketch, but that covers about 150 years, 130 years.
Those are some long thumbs.
Those are some long thumbs.
Yeah, but there's a lot going on there. There is a lot going on. That's great, and I think that's what we wanted. And that hit the spot. A couple of things I was going to note. You mentioned that Gen X starts just attaching themselves to the Rage Against the Machine, the challenging authority of Spawn and whatnot. And I go, there is something to that Gen X wanted to challenge authority, challenge the system while still making a lot of money.
Yeah.
Because money and materialism is I'm from Gen X, and I'm Gen X, it's very important to our generation. and
Absolutely.
So, and that's, hello, the 80s. Yep. So that never deviates from, we never deviated from that, for better or for worse. So it's kind of this hybrid of perhaps the previous generations, because our parents kind of rebelled against that, but then they had, the boomer parents, they rebelled against that, but then they also had, part of the reason they rebelled is they never really wanted for any,
right.
I told you they did, and I'm sure that's great, but compared to previous generations, they really didn't have that level of sacrifice. And so that's why we always say that they connect with, when a boomer criticizes millennials, you're worse than they are, and at least they're young. So that's part of it too. But I think that's important to know, because when I was thinking about when we're talking about this, we're talking about how these properties change from generation to generation, from age to age. And I go, well, we need to also consider how the generations change. How the people. We don't really have to talk about it for this episode, but we'll need to. I think it's something we'll want to touch on: how people change, how society changed, how culture changed, and what the average person wanted, and how they were influenced by the culture, but also how they influenced the culture and influenced the comic books. So there's a lot to unpack there. And so we want to talk about that. And I think also, to kind of summarize where we've been, one of the big things we wanted to note was there's the whole point of the series is the development of the hero and what the hero looks like. And included within that is the anti-hero and the plus and the minuses of the heroic stature and the different versions of heroism and the different versions of the hero, and how some of the heroes are not only vigilante, but they're violent, to a gory perspective. And so we have to compare all of those and see how, again, generationally and culturally, that it influenced that model. And then the next step, see how that compares to the biblical model of heroism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, last thing I want to say about this, like I said, it's just to kind of encapsulate it in a nutshell, is, like I said, these are stories that mirror the culture. They mirror the people reading them. Right. And so as we see cultural movements, we see comic movements. But I think an interesting question that our listeners can be asking themselves as they listen to this, especially to go forward, is which one affected which one of each other more? Did the comics shape the culture, or did the culture shape the comics, or was it a symbiotic relationship? At what point do they play on each other? Because I would generally think that they do. I don't think that they're either one's in a vacuum. I think that they do shape, the generations in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think they do. Especially, one of the things you have to look at is the audience. Mm-hmm. And we always talk about socialization and psychological development and what's happening at those ages. And if it's kids reading these comic books, then that's going to shape their view of the world, right?
Absolutely.
That's definitely one of the questions we need to discuss, how that develops. I think we also need to talk about, again, what's happening in the culture and otherwise, perhaps in the next episode. And then we can start tying in scriptural examples, maybe comparing the biblical heroes to the comic book heroes. And as we develop, again, what we're going to, the ultimate objective is to identify those positive elements of heroism, and not that there's anything negative about heroism, but how the human nature pollutes heroism, pure
Absolutely.
heroism,
Absolutely.
and what goes wrong, and not just what goes wrong with the hero, but what goes wrong with society and culture and their relationship with the hero. What else do you think we need to? What else am I missing, and what kind of summary would you have for what we talked about today?
I think we covered a lot today. I'm really looking forward to this. There's so many. I think we just cannot escape the connectivity between the hero as a narrative and us as people, and that's what has always fascinated me. There's so much reflection there for both good and bad. I mean, sometimes it's looking through a lens darkly, but there's so many elements of humanity portrayed in these characters and these narratives that I just think there's so much to talk about. And I'm looking forward to that and just kind of delving into that.
Well, I think that's what we should do then for episode 14. We can really delve into that mirror. We can talk about human nature because we already kind of touched on that.
Yeah.
Episode. We can bring some of that back up.
Definitely.
And how that influences our vision of the hero and how that influences heroes. And so, yeah, why don't we'll have that. We'll talk about maybe those elements of human nature and compare the elements of heroism. And I think that's part of what we can do. And for the audience, feel free to hop on to episode 14 when you're ready. Okay, immediately, that's great. Also, if you check on the blog and the website, we're going to have we have some of these materials available for you. Paul's summary has a great table that summarizes the eras that we just discussed and some of the properties, some of the characters that came from that. So you might want to take a look at that. And then we'll also have this comparison as well. So great. Thanks for joining us. Any final words, Paul, or you think we're kind of ready to?
I think we're ready to go. Go to number 14. Right. Let's do it.
So guys, we'll move on and we'll see you in episode 14. We'll compare human nature and heroism. Looking forward to it.